I thought staying after class meant more red ink on my paper, but the way she looked at me that evening, I realized this lesson would be nothing like the ones written in textbooks. The last bell had already rung, and most of the class had scattered out into the hallway with their usual rush of chatter and footsteps. I lingered, still gathering my things, not because I was in a hurry but because I always moved slower than the others. There was a calm I liked in being the last to leave. That's when I heard her voice. Steady, low, carrying just enough weight to stop me mid-step. "Could you stay a moment? I'd like to talk about your essay." I turned, and there she was, standing at the front of the classroom with the stack of graded papers in her hands. She didn't look stern or impatient, more thoughtful, as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. The sunlight had shifted by then, pouring long strips of amber light across the rows of desks. The room felt quieter than usual, like the air itself was holding its breath. She set the papers down on the desk, tapped the corner of one with her finger, and gave me a look that wasn't just academic. It was sharper, searching, as though she was studying me, not just my words. I walked back down the aisle slowly, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. She leaned against the desk, arms folded, her posture confident but not closed off. There was something graceful in the way she carried herself. Not the forced energy of someone trying to impress, but the ease of a woman who knew exactly who she was. "This was interesting," she said, lifting my essay, though her eyes never really left mine. "You write differently than the others. There's more weight to it, more lived in." Her words caught me off guard. No one had ever called my work that before. I cleared my throat, suddenly aware of how young my voice sounded against hers. I tried to be honest, I guess." She tilted her head slightly, studying me in silence. A faint smile tugged at her lips, the kind that felt both approving and secretive, like she knew something I didn't. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the overhead lights and the faint shuffle of papers when she set my essay back down. Then she shifted, leaning just a little closer, her hands resting on the desk now, fingers splayed as if anchoring herself. "You see the world differently," she said finally, her voice softer now, almost thoughtful. "And I wonder if you even realize how much of yourself slips between the lines." The words landed deeper than she probably intended. My chest tightened, not in discomfort, but in the strange awareness that she wasn't just talking about the essay anymore. I nodded, not trusting myself to say much. My hands tightened around the strap of my bag, trying to steady the sudden rush of nerves. That's when I realized this wasn't just a conversation about schoolwork. Something else had started quietly, in the golden stillness of that almost empty room. The door shut behind the last student, and just like that, the world outside seemed to fade away. The chatter in the hallway grew faint, muffled by distance, until all that was left was the low buzz of the lights and the soft scrape of her pen across a stack of papers. She hadn't dismissed me yet, and I hadn't moved either. I just sat there, halfway turned in my chair, caught between leaving and staying. The air in the room felt different now, like the stillness wasn't empty but full of something unnamed, pressing gently against us both. She looked up. "Come here," she said, her tone calm but firm, the way she always carried herself. Part teacher, part something else I hadn't put words to yet. I walked to her desk, each step echoing louder than it should have in the empty room. She was leaning back now, the papers set aside, her full attention on me. She slid my essay toward me, but instead of letting go immediately, she held it a second longer. Our fingers brushed. It was nothing really, an accidental touch, but the warmth of her skin lingered, soft and startling, like a spark that didn't burn but still made me aware of every nerve in my hand. I pretended to look at the notes she'd written, though all I could think about was how close she was. Close enough that I could catch the faint trace of her perfume. Not sweet, not overpowering, but subtle, elegant, like her. A quiet presence that stayed in the air even when she shifted slightly in her chair. "You write like someone older," she said, her eyes narrowing just a little, as though weighing her words. "Not in style, but in perspective. There's a patience there, an awareness." Her voice was steady, but her gaze held me still. It wasn't the look a teacher usually gave a student. Not judgmental, not distant. It was searching. And in that silence, I felt exposed. Like she could see the parts of me I usually kept hidden. I swallowed, trying to steady my thoughts. I don't always feel like I fit in with the others, I admitted. Maybe that's what you see. Something softened in her expression then. She rested her chin on her hand, studying me not as an instructor, but as if I'd said something she understood personally. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel awkward. It felt heavy, meaningful, as if words were unnecessary for that moment. A chair scraped faintly in the far corner, just the old wood settling, but it was enough to make us both glance that way. And when our eyes met again, there was a new awareness between us. She shifted the papers aside, a deliberate motion, clearing the space between us. "Let's look at this together," she said. Her shoulder brushed mine as she leaned in. A light, fleeting contact, but enough to make my breath hitch before I caught it. And suddenly the classroom, this ordinary place of desks and chalkboards and buzzing lights, felt like something entirely different. Like a boundary had quietly shifted. She pushed the essay aside with the faintest smile, as if whatever she wanted to say had nothing to do with margins or grades anymore. The desk between us felt less like a barrier now, more like a shared table where something unspoken waited to unfold. Her eyes lingered on me a moment before she asked, "Why did you really come back? Most people your age don't return once they've left. It takes something more." Her tone wasn't sharp or interrogating. It was softer, curious, as though she genuinely wanted to know, not just as a teacher, but as a woman intrigued by the person sitting across from her. I hesitated, shifting in my chair. Normally, I would have brushed the question off with a simple answer, something safe. But the stillness in that room seemed to ask for honesty, and her gaze, steady, patient, quietly urging, made me want to give it. "I guess," I said slowly. I didn't want unfinished things trailing behind me. I wanted to prove, maybe just to myself, that I could actually finish what I started. She tilted her head slightly, resting her chin on her hand, listening the way someone does when they aren't waiting to interrupt. The weight of her attention was disarming. She wasn't distracted, wasn't glancing at papers or checking the clock. She was here, with me. "And do you believe you can?" she asked softly. I met her eyes. "I have to." For a long moment, she didn't respond. Instead, she sat back, studying me in silence. Her expression had changed. Not the composed mask of a lecturer, but something more thoughtful, almost vulnerable. "I admire that," she said finally. "You don't realize how rare it is to see someone own their unfinished chapters instead of running from them." Something flickered in her voice when she said it, a quiet ache buried beneath the words. And I found myself leaning in slightly, drawn closer not just by her presence but by the faint cracks in her calm exterior. Her hair slipped loose from behind her ear, falling in a soft strand across her cheek. Without thinking, I almost lifted my hand to brush it back, but I caught myself, fingers curling against the edge of the desk instead. She noticed the hesitation, though, her eyes glancing toward my hand before meeting mine again. The air shifted between us, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift where silence speaks louder than words. I cleared my throat, trying to ground myself. "What about you?" I asked. "What brought you here?" "Teaching, I mean." Her lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That," she said, "is a longer story than we have time for tonight." Her voice was calm, but something about the way she looked away, just for a heartbeat, told me the story wasn't about career paths or textbooks. It was about something heavier, something she wasn't ready to share yet. And sitting there in that quiet room, I realized this was no longer a conversation between teacher and student. It was the beginning of something deeper, a closeness neither of us had planned for, but both of us felt. Her laughter caught me off guard. It wasn't the polite, clipped kind I'd sometimes heard in class when a student cracked a joke. This one was real, warm, unguarded, the kind that softened her whole face. For a moment, I just stared, surprised at how much lighter she looked when she let that sound escape. "You're braver than you think," she said once the laughter faded, shaking her head slightly. "Most people wouldn't admit the things you just did. Especially not to me." There was a teasing note in her words, but underneath it, something else lingered. A respect, maybe, or recognition. I smiled faintly. "Maybe I just trust you." The moment the words left my mouth, I felt their weight. Too open, too personal. But she didn't recoil. She didn't shift back into the safety of formality. Instead, her eyes softened in a way that made my chest tighten. She leaned forward across the desk, reaching for my notebook. As she did, her shoulder brushed mine. Barely a touch, but enough to send a spark of awareness through me. My pulse picked up, and I wondered if she felt it too. Her hand rested on the page, fingers tracing a line I'd written earlier. "This," she murmured. "This is what I meant. You write like you've already lived through something." I nodded, trying to steady my voice. "Maybe I have." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for a heartbeat, the air between us shifted again. It wasn't just about essays or assignments anymore. It was about the way her gaze lingered, the way her breath slowed almost in sync with mine, the way silence stretched without either of us pulling away. I could feel the warmth radiating from her where our shoulders touched. It wasn't bold or deliberate, just the kind of closeness that happens when neither person chooses to move. And yet, it felt more charged than if she'd taken my hand outright. She finally leaned back, as though catching herself, but her fingers still rested lightly on the edge of my notebook. "You remind me," she said softly, "that honesty doesn't have to be complicated." Her words sounded simple, but her tone betrayed more. A quiet longing, a flicker of vulnerability she tried to tuck away beneath her usual composure. I studied her then, not as my teacher, not as the figure I was supposed to see standing at the front of a classroom, but as a woman. Strong, graceful, yet carrying something heavy she didn't often share. The distance between us felt thinner now, fragile. And in that fragile space, every detail stood out. The faint curve of her smile, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing, the way the fading sunlight turned her hair into strands of gold. I didn't move closer, neither did she. But for the first time, it felt as though we both knew, without speaking, without touching, that the boundary between us was no longer the same as when the day began. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking time neither of us seemed eager to notice. Outside, the last slants of daylight stretched thin, painting long shadows across the desks. The classroom had become its own world, sealed away from the noise beyond its door. She hadn't said anything for a while. She was sitting across from me, elbows resting lightly on the desk, her gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. Her fingers traced slow, absent patterns across a stack of papers, not really reading them, just keeping her hands busy. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, carrying a weight I hadn't heard before. "You know," she said, "sometimes I wonder if I belong here at all, surrounded by students who are always rushing forward, chasing the next thing, while she paused, exhaling softly, "while I feel like I've already stepped past so many of those chapters." I frowned slightly, caught off guard by her openness. "You don't really mean that?" Her eyes lifted to mine, and the look there silenced me. It wasn't playful. It wasn't teasing. It was vulnerable, threaded with the kind of honesty people don't usually share in places like this. "There are days," she admitted, "when I feel like I'm standing in the doorway of a world that doesn't see me anymore. Like I'm only here to watch, not to take part." Her words lingered in the air, heavy and raw. And before I could think better of it, I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk between us. "I don't see that when I look at you," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "What I see is someone who carries herself with more strength than most people twice my age ever manage. Someone who—" I hesitated, my throat tightening. "Someone who makes me want to listen when she speaks." For the first time, her composure faltered. Her lips parted slightly, as though she had a reply but couldn't find it. She blinked once, slowly, and then looked down at her hand resting near mine. The space between us was impossibly small, her fingers barely an inch away from mine on the desk. I could see the faint tremor in them, not from weakness but from the effort of keeping something held back. I didn't reach for her, but I didn't move away either. And in that fragile stillness, the distance felt louder than words. "You're kinder than you should be," she whispered at last. Her voice trembled on the edges, though her face remained calm. I shook my head, almost smiling. "Or maybe I just see you more clearly than you expect anyone to." Her eyes lifted again, and this time she didn't look away. The silence stretched, not awkward, not heavy, but charged, as if we were both standing on the edge of a line neither of us had planned to cross. And for a few suspended moments, the only truth that mattered was that neither of us wanted to step back. The room had grown darker without either of us noticing. The last of the daylight had slipped away, leaving only the pale glow of the overhead lights. The shadows made the classroom feel smaller, more intimate, like the walls had drawn in around us, holding in the quiet weight of everything unsaid. She glanced at the clock, then gathered a few stray papers, her movements careful, deliberate. But there was something in the way she lingered, how her fingers smoothed a page that didn't need smoothing, how her gaze caught on nothing in particular. She was delaying, and I was grateful for every second she gave me. Finally, she rose from her chair and reached for her bag. The leather strap slid over her shoulder, and she adjusted it with a practiced ease. Yet her hand lingered there, gripping the strap longer than necessary, as if holding herself steady. I stood too, unsure if it was politeness or the magnetic pull of not wanting this moment to end. The space between us shrank with each quiet step I took. When she turned toward me, her eyes widened ever so slightly, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement, like she'd been waiting for me to move closer. We stopped only a breath apart. Neither of us spoke. Her eyes held mine, steady but softened, as if she were testing whether I would look away. I couldn't. My pulse thundered in my ears, but outwardly I stood still, hands at my sides, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile thread tying us together. "You should go," she said finally, her voice low. It wasn't a command. It was more like a plea. She didn't quite believe herself. I swallowed, my voice rougher than I expected. "Do you want me to?" Her breath caught. I saw it in the slight lift of her chest, the faint tremor in her lips before she pressed them together. She didn't answer right away. Instead, her hand tightened on the strap of her bag, and for the first time, I noticed it trembled. Not much, but enough. Enough to tell me she wasn't untouched by this closeness. The silence stretched between us, so sharp I felt it against my skin. My instincts screamed to bridge the inch of space that remained, to reach for her hand, her cheek, anything. But the same instincts whispered of boundaries, of risks, of all the lines we weren't supposed to cross. She seemed to feel the same tug of war, because she exhaled slowly and stepped back half a pace. Yet even then, her eyes lingered, as if apologizing for the retreat. "I'll see you next week," she said softly. Her tone was steady, but her gaze betrayed her. A flash of hesitation, of something she wanted but couldn't name aloud. I nodded, though every part of me wanted to stay rooted there forever. And as she turned toward the door, I realized the space she left behind wasn't empty at all. It was filled with everything we hadn't said, everything we'd nearly done, and everything waiting for the moment when hesitation would finally give way. I followed her to the doorway, though I kept a respectful distance. The night air drifted faintly through the glass windows, carrying the scent of damp grass from the campus lawn. She paused there, her hand resting on the frame as if she were gathering herself before stepping into the hallway. For a moment she didn't move. Neither did I. She turned back slowly, and the look in her eyes stopped me cold. It wasn't the composed mask of a teacher, not even the soft vulnerability she'd let slip earlier. It was something quieter, more deliberate, as though she'd made a choice in that heartbeat. Her gaze dropped briefly to my arm, and then she stepped closer. Just one step, but enough to close the gap she'd created when she pulled back before. Her hand lifted, hesitant at first, then certain, and came to rest lightly on my sleeve. The touch was simple, a hand against my arm, but the warmth of it sank through the fabric, steady and grounding, as if she were reminding me that all of this was real, not imagined, not one-sided. Her voice, when it came, was low but steady. "You'll stay after class again next week." There was no command in her tone, none of the authority she carried when she stood before rows of students. This time it was an invitation, a choice offered gently, waiting for me to accept. I nodded, unable to keep the faint smile from tugging at my lips. "I will." Her hand lingered a second longer before slipping away, and the absence of her touch was immediate, leaving my skin almost aching where it had been. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her composure sliding back into place, but the softness in her eyes remained. Neither of us said more. We didn't need to. The air between us carried enough, the promise of something fragile, something just beginning to take shape. When she finally stepped into the hallway, I followed at a distance, watching as her heels clicked softly against the polished floor. She didn't look back, but she didn't have to. I already knew she'd given me something to return to. Outside, the night greeted me with cool air and the hush of crickets in the distance. I drew in a breath, my chest still unsteady, and let the quiet settle around me. What had started as just another assignment had become something I couldn't have anticipated. A thread pulling me toward her, toward moments that felt heavier and yet lighter than anything I'd carried before. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a breaking of boundaries. But it was something more powerful in its restraint. A beginning wrapped in silence, in glances, in the brush of a hand that said more than words ever could. And as I walked away into the night, I knew with absolute certainty, next week, I'd be there, waiting. If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves slow-burn romance, and subscribe for more age-gap love stories told from the heart. Your support helps keep these stories alive.